I'm really thrilled to be here and to be speaking on this really interesting and important topic. I realize there are three of us on the panel, and so we all have the obligation to be somewhat laconic. My job is to sort of set the stage a little bit, to talk in broad terms about human flourishing, specifically about capitalism, looking at it from a global point of view, and looking at the remarkable attack on the morality of capitalism in our time. Now, a couple of hundred years ago, when the American founders sat around a table, not very far from here, to think about this new country that they wanted to found, they seemed very confident that they had hit upon a recipe, a formula, for a new kind of society that had not existed before. This was the Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order for the ages. And the founders were convinced that if this recipe were adopted, it would produce over time the most successful, the most prosperous, the most flourishing, and indeed the most powerful society in the world. This belief of the uniqueness of the American idea is called American exceptionalism. And very interestingly now, we are living through, you might say, the fulfillment of that dream. America is indeed the world's superpower. We are on top of the world. And yet, this is a moment of some anxiety. Why? Because first of all, America's position as the world's sole superpower is very brief and already precarious. America has in fact been a superpower for less than 20 years. America has been a superpower since World War II, but the sole superpower only after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992. And already this status appears gravely threatened. So it's worth asking at this very interesting moment in history, what is exceptional about America? What did the founders think makes America unique? What was the key ingredient of their recipe? Now, I think there are a number of elements that are unique about America, but I want to focus on just one. And that is the position in our society that is enjoyed by the entrepreneur or the merchant or the trader. Historically, the trader, the merchant, the entrepreneur has been viewed in every society, including in the West, as a kind of low-life scum. This is true universally. If you pick up the Analects of Confucius, he says that the virtuous man knows what is noble. The low man knows what is profitable. In India, where I grew up, we have the caste system. Who's at the top? The Brahmin, the priest, and below him the aristocrat, and then the warrior, and then the royalty, and down the list you go until one step from the very bottom, just above the hated untouchable, is the merchant, the entrepreneur. There's a famous essay by Ibn Khaldun, which is part of his Muqaddimah. He's the great Muslim historian of the Middle Ages, in which he seriously discusses the following question: which is a more legitimate way to get wealth? Trade or looting? And after mulling over the relative pluses and minuses, Khaldun concludes that obviously it's much better to get wealth by looting. Why? Well, because he says trade is, if you think about it, a little bit effeminate. Trade relies on low cunning. It relies on exploiting the wants and needs of other people. He says looting is very manly. Looting involves fighting a guy in open combat and taking his stuff. And this clearly draws on the manly virtue of courage. So I say all this just to give you a little sense But by the way, it's not just in non-Western cultures that this has been the view of the entrepreneur. It's also true in the West, and it's true even now in most of Europe. If you go to Europe today, in general, inherited money is better than earned money. Why? Because inherited money is innocent. You just got it. If you earned it, you probably had to run over some people to get it. And that's considered a very despicable way for you to have become wealthy. So what's unique about America, I believe, is that the American founders took, you might call it, the moral totem pole that has existed in all cultures from the beginning of humanity, and they flipped it. They flipped it such that the entrepreneur, who is generally at the bottom of the heap, suddenly comes to the top. And America is founded as an entrepreneurial society. If you read the original Constitution, Michael Novak tells us that in the original Constitution, before the Bill of Rights was added, there is only one right specifically mentioned, and that's the right to patents, to copyrights, giving you a sense of what kind of society the founders had in mind. Now, what's really interesting to me is that here we are at the dawn of the 21st century, and this very same capitalism, this very same entrepreneurship is under a kind of fierce attack of a kind it has not faced before. In fact, when I first heard this attack coming from perhaps its leading champion, which is the President of the United States, I began to think this was really odd, because didn't we hear Bill Clinton say in the late 90s that the era of big government is over? Didn't we have a 20th century debate between capitalism and socialism, and didn't capitalism win that debate? And wasn't the victory of capitalism all the more supreme from the fact that capitalism did not even seem to have an opponent left in the field? With socialism gone, there was no alternative to capitalism, it seemed. So what's going on now? What's going on here in the beginning of this new century? I think what's going on now is that the focus of the attack on capitalism has shifted. The 20th century debate was over the efficiency of capitalism. And capitalism did, in fact, win that debate. And today it is not really debated whether there is a more efficient way to create wealth. The new attack on capitalism is not based on efficiency, it is based on morality. And the idea here is that capitalism may produce wealth, but the capitalist is basically a greedy, selfish bastard. It is an attack on the ethics of entrepreneurship. And in that sense, it's very relevant to our topic here about property rights, about takings, because it gets in a way to the sense of what is right, what is morally right about this system of organizing wealth. Now, when you look at the moral attack on capitalism, what's surprising to me is that historically, this has been a problem from the very beginning. In fact, even Adam Smith, in his great defense of capitalism, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith defends capitalism, but he actually does not defend capitalists. His view of businessmen in The Wealth of Nations is rather dim. He basically says that if you leave a bunch of business guys alone in the room, it's very dangerous. They're going to immediately start to fix prices. So Adam Smith is defending capitalism, the system, but he is not defending entrepreneurs, the people. And historically, the defenders of capitalism have often been people who have agreed with the worst attacks on capitalism launched by the critics. A famous case in point is the writer Ayn Rand. In her book, The Virtue of Selfishness, she considers the attack on capitalism, you capitalists are greedy, selfish guys, and she basically agrees with it. She goes, yeah, and so what? What's wrong with greed? What's wrong with selfishness? She essentially attempts to make selfishness into a virtue, overturning, you might say, 2,000 years of Western and specifically Christian history. And this is a defender of capitalism. So in some senses, we can see the moral critique of capitalism as going largely unanswered. Largely unanswered. And what I'd like to do this evening, if I may, is try to set the tone for our discussion by focusing on, very briefly, on two prominent critiques of capitalism and of property rights, and attempt to sort of evaluate or perhaps answer them. The first one is the critique in the name of equality. The idea that capitalism may be efficient, but it produces gross and intolerable inequality. And the second is the critique in the name of morality. Is capitalism at the root based on greed and selfishness? Can capitalism defend itself against a charge that seems so obviously rooted in fact? The motive of the capitalist is obviously gain or self-interest. So the first allegation is the allegation of inequality, and it's usually framed in a very classic form. In effect, the rich are getting richer, and the poor are treading water, or the poor are getting poorer. And the question is that in fact true? I think if you look at America in the last 10, 20, or 50 years, this allegation against capitalism is in fact not true. Well, it's partly true, and what I mean by that is that the rich have gotten richer, but the poor have also gotten richer, although not at the same pace. And so inequality, in some senses, has increased, but how has it increased? It's increased ultimately not by the poor dropping down, it's increased by the rich increasing the gap between themselves and the poor. Now, if you actually look at how that's happened in America, I want to argue that it has actually happened in a way that represents a great American accomplishment. And what I mean by that is that historically, from the founding until quite recently, the great achievement of the West was to create a middle class. If you look at the way that populations are for most of time, the population of a society looks a bit like a pyramid. A very small number of rich people, another small group of middle-class people, and then everybody's poor. So the great accomplishment of the West historically was to take this pyramid, this triangle, and make it kind of into a diamond. And so you still have a small number of rich people, but now you swell the middle class. And most people are in the middle class, and you leave a relatively small number of people poor. And that's the accomplishment, to lift people out of grinding poverty and put them into the middle class, defined by comfort, but not luxury. What America has really done in the last generation or so, and we see it all around us, it's really quite incredible to watch, is America has created the first mass affluent class in world history. It has essentially taken a substantial number of people from the middle of the diamond and pushed them up so that we no longer really have a diamond. We now have an affluent class that has become quite large. In fact, the term millionaire has sort of lost its meaning, even though you have shows, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and so on. The number of families in America that have a net worth in excess of $1 million today is about 5 million. That's a very large number of Americans who now enjoy the fruit of affluence. Now, what about inequality? Interestingly, while capitalism does produce inequality in the short term, I want to argue that over the long term, looked at from a larger time scale, capitalism actually produces spectacular levels of equality, measured in the most important measures of human welfare that we can determine. So think about it this way. If you were a rich guy 100 years ago, and you had to get from place to place, you would drive one of those relatively new contraptions that were just showing up on the road. You'd go by car. If you were a poor guy, you would probably have to walk. That's a very big difference. Today, a rich guy will drive a Mercedes, and a poor guy may drive a Hyundai or a Honda Civic. That's not such a big difference. 100 years ago, if you were a rich guy and it got really cold in Philadelphia, you could move to a home in Florida, your second home for the summer, or to warm up in the winter. If you were a poor guy, you have to shiver. Today, Central heat, central air conditioning, the differences in the climate, not so significant. 100 years ago, the life expectancy gap between a rich guy and a poor guy was about 15 years. The rich guy lived to 65, the poor guy dropped dead at 50. Huge difference. Today, the life expectancy in America is around 78. The rich guy lives to 82. The poor guy drops dead at 76. That's still a difference, but it's a much smaller difference than in the past. Now, the interesting question is, what has produced the difference? What has caused the shrinking of the gap in real living standards between the rich and the poor over the past century? And the answer is, it is technological capitalism itself. It is, other things may have had an effect. You've had government programs, you've had private charities, you've had this and you've had that. But the bottom line of it is, none of those things have made as much of a difference as the engine of technological capitalism itself. It is the increase in agricultural techniques and crop yields and advances in medicine. This is what has closed the gap between the affluent and the indigent more than anything else. And today I would argue that global capitalism, what people call globalization, is itself proving to be the greatest anti-poverty program ever invented. Why? Because it is lifting tens of millions of people, not just in China, not just in India, but in Brazil and Indonesia, and in countries all around the world. In a sense, globalization has abolished the third world. And it has done so not by giving people aid, and not by giving people loans that they can't pay back, but ultimately by using what Veblen many decades ago called the advantage of backwardness. What's the advantage of backwardness? It's the advantage that poor countries that have large populations have low labor costs. And therefore, if those countries can figure out how to make stuff that other people want to buy, they have a decisive competitive advantage in the capitalist market itself. It enables them to produce goods more efficiently, more cheaply, and with technology move them more quickly. It's very difficult for the rest of the world to even compete against that. So we're seeing a massive rising tide of living standards around the world. And all of this is the result of capitalism itself. I've spoken a little bit about inequality, and now need to shift gears, and I want to talk a little bit about the question of morality. Is capitalism guilty as charged in the allegation that it is motivated at the root by greed, by selfishness? And we've heard it all. This is the heart of the Obama critique of business. It's based on profiteering. It's based on taking advantage of the little guy. Obama often talks at college commencements, and he'll tell young people, in effect, don't go into business. Don't go after the brass ring, the corner office, the year-end bonus. Obama's phrase is, you need to have, he goes, that's a kind of low ambition. His idea is you should have a nobler ambition. He doesn't specify, but maybe become a union boss or community organizer. So this is an ethical critique of capitalism, and I want to assess it for just a moment. Because the idea that capitalism is based on self-interest, I think, is to some degree undeniable. Self-interest, by the way, is not identical with greed. There's an important difference. In fact, in Scripture, we're urged to love others like ourselves, as we love ourselves. The assumption, by the way, is we do love ourselves. Think about it. If the assumption was we hated ourselves, then the implication of the biblical commandment would be to hate other people too, as we hate ourselves. But the assumption is that this self-interest, or looking out for yourself, is not in and of itself bad. But here's to me, the more interesting point about capitalism, and that is, if you look at its operational workings, if you look at its modus operandi, if you will. It's striking to me as someone who comes out of the academic or the intellectual world, the degree to which entrepreneurs and successful entrepreneurs have to be operationally empathetic in what they do. In fact, I think this is really what distinguishes the entrepreneurial world from almost any other world, including, by the way, the world of the intellectual. When I was at the American Enterprise Institute years ago, I was walking down the hallway and I strolled into the office of an eminent AEI scholar who was completing a very interesting book on, I believe it was Gnosticism in the 4th century. And he proudly handed me the galleys, and I looked at it and I said, well, this just seems like a stunning accomplishment. And then I asked him a question that I thought was rather telling. I asked him, has it ever occurred to you who wants to read about Gnosticism in the 4th century? And he said, no. It had actually never crossed his mind if anyone was even remotely interested in his subject. It sufficed for him that he was interested in it. And therefore, he was writing a masterpiece about it, and I'm sure he would be pretty ticked off if he didn't see long lines at Barnes & Noble to buy the book. In the intellectual world, it's considered normal to pursue one's own interests in relatively blind disregard of what the rest of the world, i.e. the customers, care about. But no entrepreneur could function that way. If you were selling soap or if you were selling anything, you'd have to think first about, what's my product? Who are my customers? What are their wants? What are their needs? So my point is that ordinary everyday capitalism operates by meeting and fulfilling the wants and needs of others. In fact, what's really striking to me is the most successful entrepreneurs are the supply-side entrepreneurs, and these are the people who anticipate people's wants and needs even before they have them. Here I have in my pocket a rather interesting contraption. It's the iPhone. Quite an accomplishment. Now, the interesting thing about the iPhone is that what was the demand for the iPhone before it was produced? Nil. Nobody wrote letters to Steve Jobs saying, I want an iPhone. I want it to be able to do all this stuff where I can just hit buttons and things appear. Steve Jobs and Apple anticipated, absent any demand for this product, that this product, if made and introduced to the market, would fulfill wants and needs of people that they didn't even know that they really had. And that's the most successful form of entrepreneurship, to anticipate wants and needs. So, to me, when you think about capitalism and you think about what it's motivated by, yes, there's an element of self-interest, and perhaps there's even an element of greed, but where is the greed coming from? Is the greed actually coming from capitalism? No. The greed is coming from human nature. The greed is not in capitalism, the greed is in us. Now, if you think about it, human nature has, well, Immanuel Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. And this is the human problem. Human nature has all these things in it, not just greed, but other things, lust. And over the centuries, there have in fact been groups that have attempted to root these things out, but usually with not a great deal of success. And so, in a sense, we have devised social institutions that try to channel these aspects of human nature in such a way that they work not only to the material benefit of society, but also to the betterment of the individual himself or herself. So the argument I want to sort of leave you with, if I may, is to suggest that capitalism civilizes greed in the same way that marriage civilizes lust. So, how does marriage civilize lust? Well, lust, if left to itself, would probably lead to some socially very destructive consequences. What marriage does is it attempts to steer it in such a way that it leads to mutual love, the raising of children, and so on. Good not only for society, but good for the married couple themselves. And capitalism, I think, works in much the same way. Not only does it steer the energies of the individual to the material betterment of society, that's Adam Smith's point. But I think by its everyday operation, it encourages us to think on an everyday basis about how we can go about meeting the wants and needs of other people. and that is an operationally unselfish or empathetic thing that capitalism draws on. So where does this all leave us? I think where it leaves us is by asking us, here we are, America, and we have, in a sense, built our society on this unique institution. And I think that many of our problems today arise from the fact that we have sort of lost sight of what it is that makes our country successful and strong. And in the name of a moral critique of capitalism, we are, in a sense, diminishing those things that have made America unique at a time when the world is becoming more competitive. So the world is adopting the American formula, and America, oddly enough, is moving a little bit away from it. And I think this is an important source, not the only source, but an important one, of America slipping in its standing in the world. So ultimately, the question for us is, can we as a society recover the moral sense of capitalism that animated it at the outset? Capitalism seen as a fount of creativity, of energy, of industry. Capitalism seen as not only redounding to the material betterment of the whole, but also to the moral improvement of its practitioners. And if we do so, I believe that America can compete very effectively in the world and move closer to the goal that Reagan set forward many, many years ago when he spoke about morning in America. Thank you very much.